Okay, so we're going to be talking about restrictive and non-restrictive phrases and clauses today. So this is both the stuff that's in Chapter 14 and Chapter 15, and essentially it's the same concept in both sections. Okay? So when we're talking about these, when we're looking at restrictive and non-restrictive clauses and phrases, the main concept that we need to be focusing in on is this idea of restrictive and non-restrictive. And if you think about those two words, right? Okay, so a restrictive, something that's restrictive, means that it constrains something. It pulls in around something. It tightens something up, right? Something that is non-restrictive would mean that it's not tightening things up. Okay, so the way I like to think about these, I've got a little picture here of a clown. Okay, and with our picture of the clown, then we've got the clown standing there with the clown pants on, and so I've got a skinny clown here, and when the clown is sitting there with the clown pants on, what happens if the clown doesn't put a belt on? The pants are just going to fall right off, right? Okay, because clown pants, right? When you look at clown pants, they've got those really big waists, right? They're really big and baggy. So what we talk about when we talk about something that's restrictive, it's kind of like putting a belt on this pair of clown pants. So if I put on a belt, okay, on the pair of clown pants, right, there's a belt, okay, I've got the belt buckle, okay, and I put that belt on, I cinch it up, okay, that belt is required to keep the pants up, right, okay, this belt keeps the clown's drawers from dropping. Right? It's necessary, okay? It's necessary to keep that clown's drawers from dropping. The concept of non-restrictive, then, if you think back to, I think it happened kind of mostly with kind of 80s bands, or maybe 70s bands. There was kind of like, there was lots of scarf belts that were put on. People would wear like kind of goofy scarf belts on top of the belt, whatever. And so it's kind of like this clown, right? He's already got a belt on, right? And then he puts on this fancy scarf belt on top. It's this extra belt that's absolutely not needed, right? It looks cool, right? The cool belt. Okay. Now, since we already have a regular belt, right? Okay, or yeah, I mean clowns usually would get suspenders, but let's say he's like a rock clown. Okay, so he's got to have this scarf belt, this fancy scarf belt, right? If you already have a belt on, and then you put a second belt on top of it, right? It might look groovy, right? It might look really cool, but it is not keeping your drawers up anymore, right? So the first belt was the one that restricted the waistband on the pants, right? The second belt is just there kind of to add, I don't know, add something, right? So it's not actually restricting anything. So even though it looks like it restricts, right? If you put a second belt on, it still looks like a belt, right? But it actually hasn't restricted the pants any because they're already restricted, right? Sort of like if you put if you had a wound on your arm and you put a tourniquet at the top of your arm, right, to stop the blood flow, right? Then that's the part that's going to restrict the blood flow. If you then put a fancy pretty tourniquet on top, it's not restricting anything. It may look like it is, but it's not. Okay, so non-restrictive means that it doesn't mean that it doesn't look like it restricts. It means that something was already restricted. Okay, it's already not needed to restrict. And again, it's kind of like the second belt. This is non-restrictive, this cool belt that goes on top. Okay, so what does that mean for our sentences then? So here's a sentence. The woman who bought the Pop-Tarts was sorely disappointed by the product. So as I look at that sentence, I've got a clause here, and it really doesn't matter whether it's a phrase or a clause. I mean, essentially the same rules apply. I have this clause here, who bought the Pop-Tarts? Who bought the Pop-Tarts is essentially being used to redescribe the woman. Okay, it's telling me which woman I'm talking about. Since the woman was not specific, if I was to say, point to the woman, right? If if there's several women in the room, you would point to any of them, right? In fact, if I said just generally point to the woman, you could point to, 52% of America, right? A woman, right? So who bought the Pop-Tarts really does restrict the meaning. This is like a first belt on the clown. Okay? Now here, we've got a different kind of sentence. We have Julie Andrews, who is known for being a Pop-Tart fiend, was spotted in the Austrian Alps singing "The Hills Are Alive." Okay? Now, the part that we're looking at here is who was known for being a Pop-Tart fiend. That piece, that clause, is redescribing Julie Andrews. Now, unlike before, right, on that last sentence, I'm going to go back to it, the woman who bought the Pop-Tarts was sorely disappointed. The woman is non-specific, right, non-specific. But in our next sentence, Julie Andrews is specific. If Julie Andrews was in the room with us right now, right, and I said point to Julie Andrews, right, it'd be kind of weird because she's a movie star and such, but we could point to her, right? She's a specific person. Okay, so anytime we have a name, it's specific. Even if the name was something like Bob Smith or John Doe or something that was sort of generic kind of sounding, it's still a specific name for a specific person. Okay, so since we have something specific, this who is known for being a Pop-Tart fiend, it's kind of like the second fancy belt on the clown. So this is like a first belt. So Julie Andrews already has a first belt. It's already that meaning has already been restricted. Okay, so since it's a second fancy belt, it is not restrictive. And again, the reason for that is that if it's already been restricted, you put something else that's restrictive on top of it, and it's not any more restrictive, right? Okay, if you think about with teenagers often get restrictions, right? You put on restriction, right? If a teenager gets put on restriction, and they're told they have to stay in the house for a month, and that they for that whole month they can't do anything outside of the house, right? If later that week they get in trouble, and so now for the rest of the month they can't go to movies. That second restriction really, it's just been laid on top of the first one. The first one already kept them in the house, right? So that second one actually is meaningless, right? It's not, if they already can't go out of the house, then they couldn't go to movies anyway. So even though they've been restricted a second time, it really doesn't add anything to the original restriction. The original restriction already was restrictive enough. So as we go on, then let's look at some examples. Then, so as we work through these, I want to look at what clause we're working with on each of these sentences, and then we'll try and determine whether or not it's restrictive or non-restrictive. And the key ultimately to all of this is that a restrictive clause, something that's necessary, doesn't need to be set off with commas, okay? Because it's necessary. If it's non-restrictive, if it's something that we could pull out and we'd still have specific meaning, then I can set it off with commas. I should set it off with commas. So as we look at this then, we've got my mother who works at WSU is nice. The part that is redescribing is this who works at WSU. The student who broke into the car, who broke into the car is redescribing. Spam is a meat-flavored substance which is not entirely healthy. This is the part that is redescribing. My friend who bought the record, this is the part that's redescribing. Was happy with this purchase, which was a Rare Vinyl Beatle album. This redescribes, okay? So the words that they redescribe then, this first one redescribes mother, the second one redescribes students, this third one redescribes meat-flavored substance. It seems like it might redescribe spam, but it doesn't really, because spam is at the beginning of the sentence, and this redescription really follows the meat-flavored substance. It's really redescribing that meat-flavored substance, even though, as we've talked about before, is kind of like an equal sign. So, spam is equivalent to the meat-flavored substance. So even though that's true, it's the meat-flavored substance that I'm looking at in terms of restrictive, non-restrictive. This last one here, my friend who bought the record. Now we're going to assume, maybe a hard assumption, we're going to assume that I have more than one friend. Okay, so, but that's what it's redescribing. And then finally, the purchase is what's being redescribed. I'd like you to press pause and determine which of these is restrictive and non-restrictive. Go ahead and press pause now. Okay, so one way of us doing this, then, we're going to look at each one of these ones that are circled, and we'll first ask ourselves if it's specific or not specific. So my mother is specific, right? Okay, students would be not specific. Okay, meat-flavored substance would be not specific. Okay, my friend, again, assuming if I have more than one, right? Assuming that I have more than one friend, that is not specific. How about his purchase? That's specific here, right? In this case, we've specified that this is one purchase, so this is specific. Okay, so because of that then, now because I know whether it's specific or not specific, I can now determine whether or not each of these clauses is restrictive or not restrictive. Because if it was already specific and then I have a clause that follows, it's non-restrictive and it needs commas. If it was not specific and there's a clause or a phrase that follows, then that clause or phrase is really necessary. It does restrict. Okay? So as we go through these then, the first one, my mother who works at WSU, it needs commas because this is a non-restrictive clause. This is non-restrictive. And again, those terms may seem a little bit odd, but again, it's non-restrictive, not because it couldn't restrict meaning, but because in this case it doesn't restrict meaning, because the meaning was already restricted. Again, it's a second belt. Okay. The student who broke into the car, the student, again, because the student is not specific, that who broke into the car is necessary. It restricts meaning. So we're not going to put commas on it. Restrictive. Spam is a meat-flavored substance which is not entirely healthy. Which is not entirely healthy? That redescribes meat-flavored substance. Since a meat-flavored substance, there's lots of things that taste like meat, right? In fact, what they always say, everything tastes like chicken, right? Okay, so this no commas, it is restrictive. My friend who bought the record, again, if I have more than one friend, this tells you which friend, right? It's necessary to tell you which friend. So it is restrictive. And then finally, the purchase, which was a rare vinyl pressing, I want to put in a comma because this is non-restrictive. Okay? So that's kind of the concept here. That's what we're dealing with these. Okay, let me go through just a couple more examples then. The job that I have is nice, but it does not pay enough. That I have is the clause that I'm looking at here, and it is what? Restrictive or non-restrictive? Since the job is not specific, there's lots of jobs out there, okay? This would be restrictive, okay? Camille, Who does something I don't know will be interviewing me for a job. Who does something I don't know is the part that's re-describing Camille. Camille is specific, so this would be considered non-restrictive. And so I'd want to put commas around it. This next one, my friend who has red hair. Who has red hair re-describes my friend. My friend, assuming I have more than one, right, is not specific yet. So this is restrictive, no commas. The dog whose leg is now broken ran into the woods that are on the other side of the road. Okay, so whose leg is now broken re-describes the dog. The dog, there's lots of dogs, so this is restrictive. There's lots of woods, so this is restrictive. No commas on either of those. My book, which lay on the floor, was torn. My book is not specific yet. I may have more than one book, so this is restrictive and no commas. Okay, and again, notice if I was to change any of these, if I said, instead of my book, if I gave the title of a book, right? So if I said, or a title of a magazine, so something like Time Magazine, which lay on the floor, now it would go from being restrictive to non-restrictive, right? And I would put in commas. Okay? All right.